She didn't cry when they threw the coins at her feet. She bent down, picked up every single one with bleeding hands, and kept on washing. That was Maggie Dawson, too proud to beg, too tired to break. In a town that treated her like the dirt beneath its boots, one man would ride in and see something nobody else had ever bothered to look for. This is her story. If it moves you, hit subscribe and follow along till the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. She didn't look up when the coins hit the ground. That was the first thing most folks noticed about Maggie Dawson. She never flinched. 3 copper pennies landed in the dust at her feet, thrown from Mrs. Eleanor Hatch's gloved fingers, like Maggie was a stray dog begging at the back door. "That's for the shirt," Mrs. Hatch said. "Though heaven knows it still smells. You people never do things right." Maggie set down the shirt she was scrubbing, straightened her back slowly, and bent to pick up the coins one by one. Her knuckles were cracked and red. The July heat was the kind that turned the air itself against you. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "I'll do it again at no charge." "See that you do." Mrs. Hatch's skirts rustled as she turned away. "And Margaret, if I find one more of my husband's collars wrinkled, I'll be speaking to Mr. Crowley." Maggie didn't answer. She'd learned a long time ago that some words cost more than they were worth. She'd been working the laundry behind Crowley's Mercantile since she was 14 years old. She was 23 now, and the 9 years between those two numbers felt like 40. "You let her walk on you again." The voice came from around the corner. Dottie Crane, the other laundry girl, 16 and still stupid enough to be angry about things, was watching with her arms crossed. "Go back to the rinse tubs, Dottie." She called you people, like you ain't even got a name. "I got a name. I also got a job." Maggie plunged the shirt back into the water. "Go on." "Don't it make you mad?" Maggie wrung out the collar with both hands, putting her whole body into it. "Being mad don't pay the rent." That shut Dottie up, at least for a minute. The town of Red Hollow had never had much use for Maggie Dawson. Her mother, Ruth, had been a woman of what the church ladies politely called poor reputation. And in a place like Red Hollow, a reputation was the only thing that stuck harder than mud. Maggie had inherited the mud without the reputation. She worked. She kept to herself. She paid Mr. Crowley what she owed him for the shed she slept in behind the Mercantile, and she asked for nothing from nobody. That was the deal. That was how she survived. "Maggie!" The voice cut through the steam and the heat like a blade, and her shoulders tightened before she even turned around. Gerald Crowley was a big man who'd spent years making himself bigger. He had the kind of face that smiled without warmth, all teeth, no eyes. He stood at the back door of the Mercantile, with his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, watching her the way a man watches something he owns. "You let Mrs. Hatch leave unhappy," he said. "She took the shirt back for a rewash. I offered at no charge." "She came to me first, said you were disrespectful." Maggie turned from the tub slowly, drying her hands on her apron. "I said yes, ma'am, and I bent to pick up the coin she threw in the dirt. If that's disrespectful, I'd hate to see what respectful looks like." Crowley's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He walked toward her. 2 steps, 3, stopping close enough that she had to work to keep her chin level. "You think you're clever," he said quietly. "No, sir." "Good, because a clever laundry girl is a problem I don't have patience for in this heat." He picked up the edge of her apron between 2 fingers, examining it like he was inspecting livestock. "I got 3 shirts waiting from the sheriff's office, and a full load from the hotel. You'll have them done by sundown, or I'm adding 2 days to your rent debt." "That debt's almost paid." "Almost," he smiled again. "Almost ain't done." He walked away. Maggie turned back to the tub. Dottie appeared at her elbow. He can't keep doing that. You almost have enough saved to— Go wring out the linens. Maggie, Dottie. She looked at the girl directly, and whatever was in her face made Dottie go quiet. Please. The afternoon wore on in heat and silence, and the scrape of brushes against washboards. Maggie worked through it the way she worked through everything, steady, methodical, one thing at a time. The trick to surviving a life like hers was the same as the trick to surviving a fever. You didn't think about tomorrow. You just got through the hour you were in. She was wringing out a bedsheet when she heard the hoofbeats. She didn't look up right away. Horses came through Red Hollow all the time, but this one came slow, and it stopped nearby, and there was something about the quality of the silence that followed that made her finally raise her eyes. He was sitting a gray horse at the edge of the alley, tall in the saddle, square-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from laziness, but from a man who'd learned to be patient. Dust on his coat, road-worn but clean. He was looking at her. Not the way men usually looked at Maggie Dawson, when they looked at all. Not with the dismissal of the town's women, or the lazy appraisal of the men at the saloon. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something that troubles them. She turned back to the sheet. A minute passed. "That's heavy work for this heat," he said. She didn't answer. "I didn't mean offense," he said. "I meant it as an observation. Most people's observations about my work come with an opinion attached," she said, not looking up. "I got enough of those already, thanks." She expected him to ride on. Most of them did when she made it clear she wasn't interested in conversation. He didn't ride on. "Fair enough," he said instead, and there was something in his voice. No irritation, no wounded pride, just a quiet acceptance, like she'd said something reasonable and he was treating it as such. She glanced up. He'd taken his hat off. That was the thing she noticed. He was holding it against his chest, and the afternoon sun hit the planes of his face, and he looked at her, just looked at her, steady and calm, and said, "I'm looking for the mercantile. Would you point me in the right direction, ma'am?" Ma'am. She hadn't been called ma'am since— she couldn't remember when, not without the word being wrapped in mockery. "Through there," she said, nodding toward the back door. "Go around to the front. Mr. Crowley's inside." "Thank you." He put his hat back on, touched the brim. "You have a good afternoon." He rode on. Maggie stood there for a moment with her hands in the water, staring at the wall of the mercantile. "Who was that?" Dottie said from behind her. "I don't know." She went back to work. His name was Wyatt Mercer, and by supper time, Red Hollow already had opinions about him. Maggie knew this because the women who brought their laundry in the late afternoon talked the way women in small towns always talked, like the world needed to hear every thought they had the moment they had it. "Rancher," said Mrs. Pelham, dropping a bundle of her husband's shirts on the table. "Iron Ridge Ranch, up past the North Ridge. Come to buy cattle from the Bower brothers, they say." "Handsome," said Mrs. Collins, who was younger and less careful about what she said in front of the laundry girl. "Very handsome. No wife, from what I heard." "A man with land and no wife," Mrs. Pelham said. "Won't stay that way long." They laughed together, the easy laughter of women who had never had to think about where their next meal was coming from. Maggie counted the shirts, wrote down the number in her ledger, and said nothing. "You see him ride in?" Mrs. Collins addressed this to Maggie, with the tone people used when they weren't expecting a real answer. More performing conversation than having one. "I pointed him to the front of the store," Maggie said. Mrs. Collins blinked, as if she was surprised the laundry girl had been close enough to speak to him. "Well," Mrs. Pelham said with a little sniff, "I'm sure he had no idea who he was talking to." They left. Maggie added their bundle to the pile. The evening came on slow and golden, the way July evenings did in Wyoming. The heat breaking just enough to breathe. Maggie finished the last of the hotel linens by lamplight, her back aching from shoulder blade to hip, her fingers so sore she could barely close them around the wringing handle. She was hauling a basket of finished laundry toward the drying lines when she heard voices at the front of the mercantile. Crowley's loud and easy. Another voice, quieter, measured. She kept walking. "You sure you won't stay for supper, mister?" "Mercer, my wife sets a fine table. I appreciate the offer. I'll be at the hotel tonight." "Smart man. Get a good rest. The Bauer brothers start early." A pause. "You need anything, you ask for me. Red Hollow takes care of its own." She was at the drying lines when the back door opened and Crowley stepped out. And she knew from the set of his shoulders, before he even opened his mouth, that the conversation with Wyatt Mercer had put him in a particular kind of mood. The kind where he needed to feel big, and there was only one reliable way he knew how to do that. "You're still here," he said. "Last load's drying. I'll be done in 10 minutes. "You were supposed to be done at sundown." "Sundown was 30 minutes ago, Mr. Crowley. You gave me 3 extra loads today." He came toward her slowly, picking up the edge of a shirt she'd just pinned and rubbing the fabric between his fingers. "This one's still damp." "It's on the line. It'll be dry by morning." "I don't want it dry by morning. I want it dry now." She turned to face him. "Then I'd need another hour." "Another hour." He said it slowly, like he was tasting the words. "You know what another hour costs me?" "I know what it costs me," she said quietly. Something hardened in his face. He dropped the shirt and stepped toward her, and she held her ground. She always held her ground, because the one time she'd stepped back, he'd taken 3 steps forward, and he stopped close enough that she could smell the whiskey and tobacco on him. "You're real close to the edge of something, girl," he said softly. "You know that?" "I know that." "I got men come through this town all the time. Men who see a girl like you and think things. I've kept those men away from you. You ever think about that?" She thought about it every day. That was the trap. Not just the rent debt, not just the wages he kept just low enough, but the protection he offered that she'd never ask for and couldn't refuse. "I know what you do," she said. Her voice was even. She'd practiced that evenness for years, the way you practice walking on ice. Careful, careful, don't fall. "I'm grateful for the work, Mr. Crowley." He studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, and the smile was worse than the anger. "Finish the line," he said, "and don't get any ideas. That rancher you spoke to today? Men like him don't notice girls like you." He paused at the door. "They notice, then they move on. That's all." He went back inside. Maggie pinned the last shirt with hands that trembled only a little. She did not let herself think about the man on the gray horse, or the way he'd taken his hat off, or the word "ma'am" falling from his mouth like it actually meant something. She didn't let herself think about any of it. But Wyatt Mercer came back the next morning. Maggie was at the tubs by 6, before the worst of the heat set in, and she heard the gray horse before she saw him. He came around the side of the mercantile on foot this time, leading the horse by the bridle, and he stopped when he saw her, the way you stop when you nearly walk into something you weren't expecting. "Mornin'," he said. "Mornin'." She kept scrubbing. He tied the horse to the post and stood there for a moment, and she could feel him thinking. "I was rude yesterday," she said, before she could stop herself. "I didn't mean to be." "You weren't rude," he said, sounding genuinely puzzled. "You were working." She looked up. He was leaning against the post, arms folded, watching her with that same direct, uncomplicated attention. She'd had men look at her before. She'd never had one look at her like she was a person whose thoughts he was actually interested in. "People usually expect me to stop what I'm doing when they talk to me," she said. Why would they expect that? She almost laughed. Almost. Because they're talking to me, and I'm just the laundry girl. Something crossed his face. Not pity. She'd had enough of that to last several lifetimes. But something more like recognition. Like he'd heard that logic before and found it wrong. Wyatt Mercer, he said. Iron Ridge Ranch. I know. The whole town knows. Small towns. He tilted his head slightly. And you are? Maggie Dawson. Miss Dawson. He said it like it was a complete sentence. How long you been here? 9 years. He was quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable silence. That surprised her. Most silences with men felt like they were leading somewhere she didn't want to go. This one just sat there, easy. Where are you headed after this? He asked. After Red Hollow, I mean. She set down the brush, looked at him straight. Nobody's ever asked me that. I'm asking. She picked the brush back up. I haven't thought about it. Maybe you should start, he said quietly. She didn't answer. He didn't push. He untied his horse, touched the brim of his hat, and walked it around the front of the building. She stared at the wet shirt in her hands. Nobody had ever asked her where she was going. In 9 years, not a single soul in Red Hollow had ever looked at her and wondered about her future. They looked at her hands. They looked at the laundry. They looked through her, most days, the way you look through glass. Dottie came skidding around the corner, eyes wide. Was that him? Was that the rancher? Get to the rinse tubs. Maggie! Dottie! She looked at the girl, and her voice came out rougher than she meant it to. Just give me a minute. Dottie went. Maggie bent back over the washboard, pressing hard, feeling the grain of the wood against her knuckles. Nobody had ever asked her where she was going. The question sat in her chest like a coal, hot and uncomfortable, and no matter how hard she scrubbed, it did not wash out. At noon, Crowley found her and stood watching long enough that she had to look up. Mercer came back by this morning, he said. I know. He spoke to you. For 2 minutes. Crowley nodded slowly. He wasn't angry. That was worse. When he was calm, she couldn't see what he was thinking. And not seeing what Crowley was thinking was the most dangerous state she knew. I told you, he said finally. Men like that don't... He asked where the feed store was, Maggie said. I pointed him down Main Street. That's all. The lie came smooth and easy. She wasn't proud of that. Wasn't ashamed of it either. You learn to lie when the truth cost too much. Crowley studied her face. Good, he said at last. He tapped the side of the nearest tub with 2 fingers, a habit he had, like he was counting something. You got 30 shirts waiting from the bunkhouse crew. Start on those when you're done with the hotel load. He walked away. Maggie watched him go. 30 shirts. Hotel load. Drying line. Rent debt. 6 more weeks of it, maybe 7, before the debt was clear. And then what? Another debt. Another load. Another morning of coins thrown in the dirt. And another evening of Gerald Crowley standing too close and calling it protection. She picked up the brush. She put it down. She looked at the back wall of the mercantile, at the peeling paint and the warped boards and the 9 years of her life stacked up against it like laundry waiting to be done. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't make herself stop thinking about tomorrow. She just let herself think. Maybe you should start. That was what he'd said. Simple as anything. Like it hadn't cost him a single second to say. She picked the brush back up and went back to work. But something was different now. Something small and stubborn had shifted somewhere in the place where she kept all the things she wasn't allowed to want. And she could not quite press it flat again, no matter how hard she tried. She kept her eyes on the washboard. She kept her hands moving. But somewhere deep inside Maggie Dawson, in a place 9 years of Red Hollow hadn't managed to reach, something that had been very still for a very long time had just begun to stir. Wyatt Mercer came back on the 3rd day, and the 4th. By the 5th morning, Dottie had stopped pretending she wasn't watching, and Maggie had stopped pretending she wasn't listening for hoofbeats before 6 o'clock. He never stayed long. He never said anything that could be called forward or inappropriate. He'd stop by the alley, tip his hat, ask a plain question. Once about the post office hours, once about the best road to the Bauer property. And Maggie would answer, and he would say thank you, and he would leave. Simple as that. Clean as that. It was the cleanest thing in her life, and that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. "He's coming back because of you," Dottie said on the 5th morning, wringing out a pillowcase with far more enthusiasm than the task required. "It ain't the feed store. It ain't the post office. He knows where those are by now. He's a stranger in town. Strangers ask questions. Not 5 mornings in a row they don't. Dottie, I'm just saying what's true." "Then say it quieter." Maggie glanced toward the back door of the mercantile. "Crowley's been watching the alley." That shut Dottie up properly. Both of them knew what Crowley's watching meant. Maggie went back to the washboard and worked her hands raw and tried not to think about the way Wyatt Mercer looked at her. Straight on, no flinching, no looking through. Like she was someone worth the direction of a gaze. It was dangerous, that look. She'd seen what happened to women in Red Hollow who let themselves believe a man's eyes meant something. She'd watched her own mother do it, over and over, with a whole series of men who looked warmly and left coldly. And every time, Ruth Dawson had ended up smaller than before, a little less of herself each time, until there was almost nothing left but the bitterness and the bottle. Maggie was not her mother. She had made that decision so many years ago, it didn't even feel like a decision anymore. It felt like bone. But she was listening for hoofbeats. That was the truth she couldn't scrub out. He came at 6:30, earlier than usual, and he didn't ask about the post office, or the feed store, or the road to anywhere. He walked straight to the alley, took off his hat, and said, "Miss Dawson, I'd like to speak plainly if that's all right." Maggie set down the brush. Her heart did something inconvenient. She ignored it. "All right. I've been coming back here because I wanted to." He said it direct, no decoration. "Not because I needed directions." "I know," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, that she'd said it so level. And I don't know what you want, Mr. Mercer. Men like you don't generally—" She stopped, heard Crowley's voice in her head, shook it off. "I've been in this town 9 years. I know what people think of me. I know what they'd think of you for standing in this alley 5 mornings running. I don't much care what this town thinks of me. Then you're the first person in Red Hollow who doesn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm leaving Friday." Something cold dropped through her chest. She hadn't expected that to land the way it did. "Then you ought to stop coming by." "I thought the same thing," he said. "And then I thought about that question I asked you. Where you were headed after this." She looked at him. She'd been careful about that, about looking directly. She looked now. "What about it?" "You didn't answer me." "I noticed." "I'd like you to think about something," he said. He turned his hat in his hands, once, the way a man does when he's choosing words carefully. Iron Ridge Ranch needs a cook, a housekeeper, someone to run the domestic side of things. It's honest work, steady wages, your own room in the main house. He paused. "I'm offering you the position, Miss Dawson, if you want it." The silence that followed was so complete, she could hear the flies at the water barrel. "You're offering me a job," she said slowly. "Yes." "On your ranch?" "Yes." She turned back to the washboard. Her hands found the brush automatically. "Mr. Mercer, I don't know if anybody's told you about me, but this town has got plenty to say. You take a woman like me to your ranch, people will— I know what people will say. I've heard it before about other things." His voice didn't waver. "I'm asking you if you want the work. Not what the town thinks, not what Crowley thinks. What do you want?" She scrubbed hard at a collar. Her jaw was tight. "That's a dangerous question." "Is it?" "For women like me, it is." She made herself stop, made herself set the brush down and face him. "I want out of this alley. I want enough money to buy a meal without counting what's left after. I want to go one morning without somebody reminding me that my mother was who she was." Her voice stayed even. She was proud of that, even as something raw cracked open underneath the words. "I've wanted those things for 9 years, Mr. Mercer. Wanting don't cost a thing. Getting is another matter." He didn't look away, didn't soften it up with something easy. He just held her eyes and said, "What would it take for getting to be a possibility?" She opened her mouth, and the back door of the mercantile swung open. Crowley filled the frame like a storm moving in. His eyes went from Maggie to Wyatt and back, and the calculation in his face was fast and cold and ugly. "Mr. Mercer," he said, with his company's smile on. "Didn't expect to see you back this way." "Just finishing up some business," Wyatt said. He didn't look rattled. He turned to Crowley the way you turn to face something you've already decided isn't a threat. "Mr. Crowley." "Business." Crowley repeated the word like it tasted wrong. "What kind of business has a man like you in the service alley with my laundry girl?" The phrase hit Maggie in the sternum. My laundry girl. Like she was a tool hung on his wall. "Employment business," Wyatt said. "I was offering Miss Dawson a position at my ranch." Everything stopped. Crowley's smile went somewhere complicated. "Is that right?" "That's right." A beat. 2. Crowley stepped out of the doorway and came toward them, easy and slow, the way a man walks when he wants to remind you he owns the ground underfoot. "That's real kind of you. But Miss Dawson's got obligations here. Don't you, Maggie?" It wasn't the question. Maggie's hands were still at her sides. "I have a debt," she said. Flat. Factual. "What kind of debt?" Wyatt asked. "Room and board," Crowley said, before she could answer. "Miss Dawson lives on my property, eats from my kitchen when she needs to. That comes with a cost. She understands the arrangement." "How much?" Wyatt said. Crowley blinked. "Pardon?" "How much does she owe you? I'll settle it." The silence this time had a different quality, thick and hot, like the air before a lightning strike. Crowley's smile went away entirely. "That ain't how it works, Mr. Mercer." "Seems straightforward to me. She owes a debt, the debt gets paid, she's free to take other employment. That's how debts work." "This is a private arrangement between me and my employee." Crowley's voice dropped a register. "I'd appreciate you staying out of business that ain't yours." "Miss Dawson." Wyatt turned to her, ignoring Crowley entirely. And the deliberateness of that, the calm refusal to treat Crowley as a man whose anger needed managing, made something electric move through the air. "How much do you owe him?" She felt Crowley's eyes on the side of her face like a brand. She also felt, for the first time in 9 years, the strange and terrifying weight of having a choice. $11.40, she said. Wyatt reached into his coat pocket. "Now wait just a minute," Crowley started. Wyatt counted out $12 in coin and set it on the edge of the nearest tub without looking at Crowley. He looked at Maggie. That cover it? She stared at the coins. $12. 3 weeks' wages. For him, probably nothing. For her, 9 years of a trap sprung open. Yes, she said. Then, as of right now, you don't owe this man anything. He turned to Crowley. The pleasantness was still on his face, but underneath it, something had gone iron hard. Is that agreed, Mr. Crowley? The look Crowley gave Wyatt was the kind that men save for when they're working out whether they're willing to make something physical. Wyatt stood still through it, without blinking, and after a long moment, Crowley picked up the coins. Agreed, he said softly. But the shed she sleeps in, she won't be needing it, Wyatt said. She'll be at the hotel tonight and on the road to Iron Ridge tomorrow morning. He turned back to Maggie. If that's what she wants. Every eye was on her. Crowley's, calculating, furious, a man already planning. Wyatt's, steady, waiting, giving her the thing nobody had ever given her before, the actual right to say no. She thought about 9 years. She thought about coins in the dirt. I'll need an hour to pack, she said. The hour turned into a war. She had 4 things worth keeping. Her mother's button tin, a change of dress, her ledger book, and the money she'd been saving, $4 and some cents, sewn into the lining of her second petticoat. Packing took 11 minutes. The rest of the hour was Crowley. He came to the shed while she was pulling her dress off the hook on the wall, and he stood in the doorway of the place he'd rented her, at a price she could never quite pay off. And he said the things men say when they've run out of power and don't know how to hold it. You think that man's going to save you, Maggie? I think I'm taking a job, she said. She didn't look at him. A job. He laughed, and the laugh was ugly. He's going to use you same as everybody else, except you'll be 30 miles from town with nobody to know about it. Maybe. She folded her dress into the bag. But I'll be 30 miles from here, which is an improvement regardless. You'll be back. He said it quiet, with the certainty of a man who's watched people try to leave before. They always come back. She picked up her bag. She turned around. She looked him in the face, which she'd been careful not to do for most of 9 years, and she studied him. The puffed-up pride of him, the cruelty dressed in helpfulness. And she said, Then you won't mind waiting. She walked past him out the door. He called after her, something about references, something about her mother, something she couldn't quite make out over the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. She kept walking. The July heat came down on her shoulders like a hand. She kept walking. Wyatt was waiting by the front of the mercantile with his horse. He saw her come around the corner, and he didn't say anything. Didn't celebrate, didn't make a fuss. Just took the bag from her hand and tied it to the saddlebag with the matter-of-fact ease of a man doing a practical thing. Hotel first, he said. I'll arrange a room. I can pay for my own room, she said immediately. He looked at her. All right. And I want it clear between us, Miss Dawson. His voice was quiet, but direct. This is a job offer. You'll have wages, your own room, and you'll answer to nobody but me for the work. And I don't ask for anything outside the work. I want that clear, too. She studied him. Why? Why what? Why do any of this? You don't know me. I'm nothing to you. You could have hired any woman in 3 counties without involving yourself in Crowley's affairs and setting this whole town talking. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been running Iron Ridge alone for 4 years. I know what it looks like when someone's working hard and getting nowhere. Didn't sit right with me, leaving you here. Didn't sit right, she repeated. No, ma'am. She looked at him a moment longer. Something in her chest was doing things she didn't have names for, and she was suspicious of all of them. I'm not a charity case, Mr. Mercer. No, he said, with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. You're an employee. Big difference. He took the horse's bridle and nodded toward the main street. Come on, I'll buy you supper and we can discuss the terms properly. She fell into step beside him. The main street of Red Hollow received them with the particular silence of a town that has stopped talking because the thing it was talking about has just walked into view. She felt it. Every storefront, every porch, every pair of eyes that skated away the moment she glanced at them. She'd been invisible for 9 years. She was not invisible now. Mrs. Hatch stood in front of the dress shop and watched them pass with an expression Maggie had never seen on the woman's face before. Not contempt. Something else. Something with more heat to it. Dottie appeared from around the side of the land office and stopped dead, mouth open. Maggie met her eyes, gave her a small nod. Dottie's face broke into something that was half grin, half disbelief, and she pressed both hands over her mouth to keep whatever she was feeling inside. Supper was at the far end of the hotel dining room, and for 20 minutes, nobody in the room talked about anything except very pointed topics, like the weather and the cattle prices. Too deliberately, too carefully, which meant every single person in that room was listening. Wyatt talked about Iron Ridge like it was a practical matter, because to him it was. The ranch sat on 400 acres. He ran a herd of 200 head. He had 3 permanent hands, Boone, who'd been with him since the start, and 2 brothers named Callow and Fitch. The house was large enough that she'd have her own section. The work was real, was steady, was respected. "Any questions?" he said at the end of it. "What happened to whoever had the job before?" she said. He paused, just 1 beat too long. "There wasn't anyone before." She looked at him. "4 years you've been out there and no one running the house?" "I managed." "By managing, you mean eating bad food and letting the laundry pile up." Something moved across his face that was definitely in the smile family, even if it didn't quite commit. "I've been busy with the cattle." "Right." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "And now you're riding through Red Hollow, and suddenly you need a housekeeper." "I've needed one for a while," he said. "I just hadn't found the right fit." The phrase sat between them. He seemed to realize how it sounded, because something shifted in his expression. Careful, like a man trying to pick up something fragile without dropping it. "Miss Dawson," he said, "I want to be honest with you." "I wish you would be." "I saw you that first morning, working in that alley in July heat. I watched you pick those coins up out of the dirt and say, 'Yes, ma'am,' to a woman who called you less than your name." He set his fork down, looked at her straight. "And I thought, that's a woman who deserves better than what she's getting." That was all. That's still all. She held very still. Most men who think a woman deserves better are thinking they're the better she deserves. "I know." He met her eyes without flinching from that. "I'm not most men. I'm also not going to tell you that, because a man who tells you he's not most men generally is. I'll just say that I mean what I offered, and I don't mean anything else. And the rest I'll let you watch for yourself and judge." The dining room had gone very, very quiet. She picked up her coffee. She drank it. She set it down. "When do we leave?" she said. "First light." "Then I'll be ready." He nodded once and went back to his food, and that was that. No fanfare, no performance. Just the practical finality of a man who'd said his piece and meant it. She ate in silence, and the dining room slowly, carefully resumed its noise around them. And somewhere in the careful architecture of Maggie Dawson's chest, a door that had been bolted shut for 9 years was not yet open. But the bolt had moved. Just slightly. Just enough to feel it. She didn't sleep well. She wasn't sure she'd expected to. The hotel room was small and clean and achingly unfamiliar, and she lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to Red Hollow settle into its nighttime sounds and thought about every good thing she'd ever let herself almost believe in before it came apart. Because that was the thing nobody talked about when they talked about hope. It wasn't free. Every time you let it in, you were putting something at stake. And Maggie Dawson had learned, the way children learn things in hard houses, which is to say, permanently, that the cost of hope was always paid by the person who could least afford it. She thought about her mother, about the men Ruth had trusted, about the particular mathematics of a woman with no options and a man who knew it. She thought about Wyatt Mercer setting $12 on the edge of her washtub without blinking. She thought about the way he'd said, "You're an employee." Big difference. Like it mattered to him that she understood the distinction. She pressed her hands flat against the bedsheet and stared at the dark. Tomorrow she would get on a horse and ride 30 miles from the only life she'd ever known with a man she'd spoken to 5 times, toward a ranch she'd never seen, to do a job she hadn't been asked about before today. Every sensible part of her said she was a fool. The part that had felt something shift in her chest when he set those coins down said, "Maybe you should start." At some point before dawn, she slept. At first light, she was standing out front of the hotel with her bag, 20 minutes before he'd said to be ready. He came around the corner leading both horses, the gray and a chestnut mare he hadn't had yesterday, and he stopped when he saw her standing there. And for just a second, something moved across his face that she didn't have a category for. "You're early," he said. "So are you," she said. He looked at the mare. "She's steady, good for long roads." Maggie reached out and put her palm against the horse's neck. The mare didn't shy. She stood easy, warm, and solid, like something you could lean against. "What's her name?" Maggie asked. "Didn't have one." He handed her the reins. "Thought maybe you'd want to name her yourself." She held the reins and looked at him over the horse's neck, and she searched his face for the angle. There was always an angle. And she found nothing but the plain, undecorated truth of a man standing in the early morning, waiting for her to be ready. She named the mare July. It seemed right somehow. For a month that had started with coins in the dirt and ended with a road she hadn't known existed 24 hours ago. Hot and hard, and not without its own kind of beauty, if you knew where to look. They rode out of Red Hollow before the town was properly awake, and Maggie did not look back. Not once. Not even at the alley. The road opened up ahead of them in the summer gold of an early morning, and Maggie Dawson rode toward it with her spine straight and her hands steady and something burning quiet in her chest. Small but real. The way fires start before they become something you can't ignore. Red Hollow shrank behind her. The road went on. The road to Iron Ridge Ranch took 4 hours, and Maggie spent most of them in silence that wasn't uncomfortable, which was new enough to notice. Wyatt rode easy, like a man who'd done this particular road so many times it had become part of him. He pointed out landmarks without being asked. A creek crossing, a rock formation that looked like a sleeping dog, the ridge itself running dark and long against the summer sky. Not chit-chat, not filling silence for the sake of it. Just a man giving a woman information she'd need if she was going to know where she lived. She cataloged everything. That was habit. The habit of a woman who'd learned that knowing your terrain was the first line of defense against being caught wrong-footed. "How long you been at Iron Ridge?" she asked, somewhere around the second hour. "Built it myself," he said. 6 years ago. Took 2 years before it could be called a working ranch." "Alone?" "Had Boone from the start. Met him on the trail up from Texas. He's hard to like and harder to get rid of. which makes him useful. Something almost like a smile moved through her. I'll keep that in mind. The Callow brothers came later. They don't talk much, which I appreciate. They work hard, which I appreciate more. He glanced at her sideways. They're good men. I want you to know that before you meet them. You're warning me? I'm giving you context. He looked ahead. 3 men who've been living without a woman's management for 4 years. The house reflects that. I want you prepared. How bad? She said. He was quiet for 2 full seconds. That bad, she said. I've been meaning to address it, he said, for 4 years. I've been busy with the cattle. She looked at the road ahead and thought, well. She'd scrubbed blood out of strangers' shirts for 9 years. Whatever Wyatt Mercer's housekeeping situation was, she'd seen worse. She was wrong about that. Boone was waiting in the yard when they rode in, a lean, weathered man of about 50, with a face like old saddle leather and eyes that missed nothing. He watched Maggie dismount with the assessment of someone making a calculation, and he came straight to the point, the way men who've lived without social obligations for too long tend to. She stayin'? He said to Wyatt. Miss Dawson, yes, she's the new housekeeper. Wyatt handed off his reins. Boone. Boone looked at Maggie with the blunt frankness of a man who hadn't practiced subtlety. Can you cook? Yes, she said. Real cookin'? Not just biscuits? Boone, Wyatt said, with the tone of a man who'd had this conversation before and was tired of it. I can cook a full supper with what's in a half-empty larder, Maggie said, which, from what I understand, describes your current situation accurately. Boone stared at her for a moment. Something in his face shifted. Not warmth exactly, but the preliminary stage of it. Welcome to Iron Ridge, Miss Dawson, he said, and walked away with the horses. The house was worse than she'd imagined, and better than she'd feared, which was about the most diplomatic thing she could say about it. It was big, genuinely big, with rooms that could have been beautiful if anyone had thought to care for them. Nobody had thought to care for them. She walked through it with Wyatt 2 steps behind, and she didn't say anything because there was too much to say, and she was still deciding which disaster to address first. Your room is here, he said, opening a door off the back hallway. It was clean, she would say that. Small, but clean, with a window, a real bed, a washstand. Clean, like he'd prepared it. Like he'd prepared it before he went to Red Hollow. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room and felt that thought move through her like cold water. You planned this, she said, before you came to town. A pause. I needed someone for the house, yes, but you specifically came to Red Hollow. He didn't answer right away. That silence told her more than the answer would have. Why Red Hollow? She said. She turned around. Mr. Mercer. Why that town, specifically? He stood in the hallway and looked at her with that steady, unhurried gaze. Why don't you get settled first? Supper in an hour. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. He walked away down the hall. She stood in the doorway of her room and watched him go, and felt the thing she'd been trying not to feel since the moment he'd set $12 on the edge of her washtub. Suspicion. Old and practiced and necessary, rising like groundwater after rain. She unpacked her 4 possessions. She put her mother's button tin on the windowsill. She washed her hands and face, and she went to find the kitchen. Supper turned out to be the first battle she won at Iron Ridge Ranch, and she needed it. The larder had salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, 3 onions, and the heel of a flour sack. She made do. She'd been making do her entire life. By the time the Callow brothers came in from the east pasture, shorter than Boone and quieter, as advertised, with the quiet faces of men who'd learned that silence was easier than speech, there was actual food on the table, hot and real, and the 4 men ate it with the focused attention of people who hadn't had a proper meal in longer than they'd admit. Nobody said anything for several minutes. Then Boone looked up from his plate and said, "You're staying." It wasn't a question this time. "That's the arrangement," Maggie said. He went back to eating. Across the table, the younger Callow brother, Felix, she'd learned, glanced up at her with something that might have been gratitude, if you caught it quick enough. Wyatt sat at the head of the table and said nothing and ate his food. And when she refilled his coffee without being asked, he looked up with that expression she still hadn't categorized and said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Dawson." "That's the job," she said, and went back to the stove. But she felt his eyes follow her, and she didn't know what to do with that. So she did what she always did with things she didn't know what to do with. She worked harder. 3 days passed. She cleaned the house one room at a time, working from first light until the heat forced her inside, then starting again in the cool of the late afternoon. She organized the larder, took stock of what was needed, made a list in her ledger. She fixed the broken latch on the kitchen door that had apparently been broken for 18 months, using a nail and a piece of wire she found in the barn. Boone watched her do it from the fence post, with an expression that was moving steadily toward respect. "Where'd you learn that?" he said. "Red Hollow. When something breaks and there's nobody to fix it, you fix it." "Crowley's place?" She kept her eyes on the wire. "You know Crowley?" "I know of him." He was quiet for a moment. "Wyatt mentioned it." "Did he?" "Said you'd been there a long time. Said you'd been treated poorly." He shifted on the post. "I've known Wyatt Mercer 8 years, Miss Dawson. He doesn't do things without a reason. He doesn't talk about those reasons before you've earned them." She straightened up. She looked at Boone directly. "What does that mean?" "Means be patient." He climbed down from the fence. "He's a man who does right by people. That's all I can tell you." He walked back toward the barn, and Maggie stood there in the July heat with the wire in her hand and the unanswered question from the first night still sitting in her chest like a stone she couldn't put down. Why Red Hollow? Why specifically? The answer came on the 4th night, and it didn't come from Wyatt. She was in the kitchen after supper, washing the last of the dishes, when she heard horses coming fast up the road. Not one horse, 2, maybe 3. She dried her hands and went to the front room, and through the window she saw Wyatt come off the porch already, which meant he'd heard them too. She went out. There were 2 riders. One was a boy she didn't recognize, young, ranch hand type, somebody's errand runner. The other was a man she recognized immediately, and the recognition landed in her stomach like a fist. Deputy Cal Reeves of Red Hollow. Short, thick-necked, with the small, mean eyes of a man who enjoyed his authority in direct proportion to how little he actually had. "Evening, Mercer," Reeves said, not getting down from his horse. His eyes found Maggie on the porch and stayed there. "Miss Dawson." Wyatt stood between the horses and the porch. "Reeves, little far from your jurisdiction." "Just a friendly call." Reeves reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "Got a legal matter to discuss. Crowley's filed a claim. Says Miss Dawson made off with property belonging to him when she left his employ." The air went out of her lungs. "That's a lie," she said. "Says one of his shirts went missing. A good one. Worth more than the $12 your boss man paid." Reeves smiled with his teeth. "He's willing to forgive the whole thing, Miss Dawson. Says he'll drop the claim if you come back to Red Hollow and take up your post. Says he misses your work." The sickness of it moved through her like poison. The genius of it, the trap inside a trap. It wasn't about the shirt. There was no shirt. This was Crowley telling her, with the law as his messenger, that $12 hadn't bought her freedom, that she didn't get to leave, that nobody left Gerald Crowley without his permission. "She isn't going anywhere," Wyatt said. His voice hadn't changed temperature. That steadiness of his, she'd found it comforting before. Right now, it was the only solid thing she had to grab onto. "Mr. Mercer, I'd advise you not to—" "She doesn't owe Crowley anything. I settled her debt personally. The man watched me count the coins." Wyatt took the paper out of Reeves's hand, unfolded it, read it for 10 seconds, folded it back. "This claim has no standing. You rode 30 miles on a nothing errand, Reeves. I'd start back before it gets dark." Reeves looked at Maggie over Wyatt's shoulder. "It's a serious matter, Miss Dawson. Theft charge can follow a woman a long time." "There was no theft," she said. "I left with my own 4 possessions and the clothes on my back. Any man or woman at that mercantile can verify it." "Crowley says otherwise." "Crowley says a lot of things," she said. "Most of them in proportion to how much he needs you to believe them." Reeves's face went cold. He took back the paper, looked at Wyatt. "This ain't finished." "That's fine," Wyatt said. "When it continues, it can continue through a proper court. My lawyer's in Cheyenne. Name's Edward Holt. Send Crowley his way." Something flickered in Reeves's face. Not uncertainty exactly, but the shadow of it. Men like Crowley operated on the assumption that the people they threatened couldn't afford to fight back. A lawyer in Cheyenne was a problem he hadn't been sent to solve. He turned his horse without another word. The errand boy followed. They rode back down the road in the direction they'd come. The yard went quiet. Maggie stood on the porch and watched the dust settle and felt her hands shaking. Not from fear, or not just from fear, but from the particular kind of rage that comes from being hunted on a road you thought you'd finally gotten clear of. Wyatt came up the porch steps and stood beside her, and they both watched the empty road for a moment. "He won't stop," she said. "No," Wyatt said. "He won't. He'll make up something else, another claim, another paper." She pressed her hands flat against her thighs to stop the trembling. "He did it to Martha Gill 3 years ago. Girl tried to leave to marry a man from Laramie. Crowley had her father's old note called in the week before the wedding. Marriage fell through. She's still there." She looked at Wyatt. "He doesn't let people go. That's how he keeps them." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. Something in the way he said it made her go still. "You know," she repeated. He looked at her. The last of the evening light was on his face, and in it she could see the thing he'd been carrying since Red Hollow. The thing Boone had told her to be patient for. "Mr. Mercer," her voice was very careful, "I'm going to ask you again. Why Red Hollow?" He exhaled slowly. He turned and leaned against the porch rail, facing her, and in his face was the look of a man who's made a decision that's been a long time coming. "I didn't go to Red Hollow for cattle," he said. The porch went very still. "I went because of Crowley." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "I've been looking into him for 8 months. There's a land claim, the north parcel, 2 miles from the edge of Red Hollow. Crowley's been filing papers on it, but the deed's not clean. The original owner signed it under duress, and there are 3 witnesses who know it." He stopped. "One of those witnesses is your mother." The world tipped slightly. She gripped the porch rail. "My mother," she said. "Ruth Dawson. She was present when the original deed was signed. Crowley's been keeping her in Red Hollow, same way he kept you. Debt, dependency, fear. He knows what she saw. He needs her quiet." Maggie let that move through her. All of it. The 9 years. The debt that never fully cleared. The way Crowley's eyes had always gone careful when her mother's name came up. "You came to Red Hollow to find a witness," she said. "I came to Red Hollow to understand how Crowley operates. What I found was—" He stopped again. "I found a woman in an alley, picking coins out of the dirt, saying, 'Yes, ma'am,' to people who weren't worth her breath. And I thought," he set his jaw, "I thought one thing at a time. Get her clear of him first. The rest could follow." She stared at him. "He didn't tell me," she said. "You offered me a job and let me think it was charity, and you didn't tell me." "It wasn't charity," he said immediately. "I meant every word about the work. The job is real. The wages are real." "But you had another reason." "Yes. I was part of your plan." "You were someone who needed to be out of that man's reach," he said. "Whether my reasons were one thing or two things, that part was true." She let go of the rail. She turned away from him and walked to the far end of the porch and stood there with her back to him and pressed her hands flat against the wood and breathed. He waited. He didn't follow her, didn't push, just waited, the way he always waited, patient and steady and infuriating. "My mother," she said to the dark. "She's still there." "Yes." "Crowley's got her, same as he had me." "Yes." "And you need her testimony." "I need her to be willing to speak," he said carefully. "I can't force that. I wouldn't." She turned around. She looked at him across the length of the porch, and she thought about every version of this moment she'd imagined since the first day she'd felt the bolt in her chest begin to shift. Every way a man could turn out to be exactly what she'd been afraid he was. And she thought, he came clean. He could have kept it from her forever. The job was real. The room was real. He hadn't touched her, hadn't asked for a single thing outside the work, hadn't treated her as anything but a person with her own mind. And when Crowley's deputy came riding up with threats wrapped in legal paper, Wyatt Mercer had stepped between them without being asked and named his lawyer in Cheyenne without blinking. None of that was nothing. None of it was everything, either. "I want to write to my mother," she said. "All right. And I want to know everything, all of it. The land claim, Crowley's papers, what you've got, what you need." She came back across the porch and stopped in front of him, and looked him in the face with every year of red hollow behind her eyes. "I'm not a card you're playing, Mr. Mercer. You want my help with this, you treat me as a partner. Full information. No decisions made about my life without my knowing." He held her gaze. "Agreed. And if I decide I don't want any part of what you're building here, the case, the land, whatever it is, I keep the job and the room, and you find another way." "Agreed," he said again, without hesitating. She studied him for a long moment. The night was full around them, and the ranch was quiet, and somewhere out on the dark road, Crowley's deputy was riding back to Red Hollow with an unfinished answer. "Then start talking," she said, and she sat down on the porch step and waited. He sat across from her and told her everything. It took most of the night. The story Wyatt told her took 3 hours and left her with cold coffee and a head full of things she needed to sit with. The land in question was a north parcel, 80 acres of good grazing ground that a man named Thomas Hale had homesteaded 12 years ago. Hale had been a quiet man, a decent man, the kind Red Hollow had plenty of use for until he stopped being useful. When the drought hit and Hale fell behind on his supplies, Crowley had stepped in with credit, the particular kind of credit that came with papers signed in the back office at the Mercantile, with witnesses present who were dependent enough on Crowley to say whatever needed saying. Hale had lost the land inside of a year. He'd left Red Hollow shortly after, and nobody had seen him since. But there had been a fourth person in that back office the day the papers were signed. A woman who'd come in to settle her own account and had stayed too long and heard too much. Crowley had kept her close ever since. Debt, dependency, the steady drip of just enough that leaving seemed harder than staying. Ruth Dawson, Maggie's mother. Maggie had sat on that porch step and let Wyatt's words move through her, and thought about her mother's eyes. The particular flatness in them that she'd always read as indifference, and now, sitting on this porch 30 miles from Red Hollow, in the middle of the night, was beginning to wonder if it had been something else entirely. Fear dressed as distance. Silence dressed as not caring. She wrote the letter the next morning. She sat at the kitchen table before anyone else was up, and she wrote to her mother for the first time in 4 years. And she kept it plain, because Ruth Dawson had never responded well to sentiment, and Maggie had no patience left for dancing around the truth. I'm at Iron Ridge Ranch, north of Red Hollow. I'm safe. I have work. I need to talk to you about Thomas Hale and what you saw in Crowley's back office. You don't have to be afraid anymore. I mean that. Write back or come. Either way, I'll be here. She didn't sign it with love. She signed it with her name. Wyatt posted it himself when he rode to the Crossroads store. He came back in the early afternoon and didn't say anything about it, which she appreciated. There was nothing to say yet. They had to wait. Waiting, Maggie Dawson had learned, was its own kind of work. 8 days passed. She fell into the rhythm of Iron Ridge the way water finds the shape of a vessel. Not because she was passive, but because the shape was a reasonable one, and she was tired of fighting unreasonable shapes. The house came clean, room by room. The larder filled up on the supply run she accompanied Wyatt on, to a trading post well north of Red Hollow, and she negotiated the price on the flour herself, because the man behind the counter tried to charge double what it was worth, and she recognized that particular move from years of practice. Wyatt watched her talk the man down 40 cents and didn't say anything until they were back on the road. You didn't need me for that, he said. I needed the wagon, she said. Something moved in his face that was becoming familiar to her. The not quite smile. The way his jaw shifted when he was working to keep something in. Boone was warming to her in the way of a man who communicates entirely through the withdrawal of hostility. He'd stopped watching her sideways. He'd started leaving his coffee cup on the counter instead of taking it with him, which meant he trusted her to refill it. Felix Callow had started saying good morning. His brother Tomas had fixed the broken step on the back porch without being asked, which she suspected was his version of a peace offering. She was making a place here. That was the terrifying and incredible truth of it. She was making a place, and it was starting to feel like it might hold her weight. She didn't let herself lean into it too hard. She'd been fooled by solid-looking ground before. But she stopped bracing quite so much against the fall, and that was something. At night, after supper, she and Wyatt had taken to sitting on the front porch while the day cooled. Not every night, not by arrangement. It had just started happening, the way things between two people start happening when they're in the same place long enough. Organically, without ceremony, as natural and as terrifying as anything she'd ever let herself have. He talked about the ranch. She asked questions. He answered them like they mattered, which they did. She was managing his house. She needed to understand the operation. But after a while, the questions weren't all practical ones. You never told me why you built it here, she said on the 5th evening. Iron Ridge? Specifically here. 400 acres is a lot of land. A man could have settled anywhere. He looked out at the dark for a moment. I came up from Texas with $100 and Boone and a direction. North. I rode until I found a piece of ground that felt like it could grow something and hadn't been ruined yet. He was quiet. Took 3 weeks of arriving. That's not why, she said. He glanced at her. That's how, she said. That's not why. He looked out at the dark again. A long pause. I had a family once. Wife. We'd been married 2 years. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, and she felt the weight underneath the plainness. Fever took her. the baby with her. She didn't say she was sorry. She'd found over the years that the words landed soft and hollow on real grief. And Wyatt Mercer didn't seem like a man who wanted soft and hollow. She just stayed where she was and let him keep talking if he wanted to. "I rode north because I needed to be somewhere nothing knew my name yet," he said. "Somewhere I could build something that wasn't full of the shape of what I'd lost." He stopped. "That's why." She held it carefully, the way you hold something that cost someone a lot to put down. "Did it work?" she said. He looked at her. In the dark, his face was hard to read, but she'd been learning it, the way you learn a difficult text, slowly, with attention. "Some days," he said. She nodded. She didn't push. They sat a while longer, and the night moved around them, and she thought about shapes, the shapes loss makes in a person, the shapes you build afterward, and whether the new ones ever stop feeling like replacements. The reply from Red Hollow came on the 9th day. Not from her mother, from Crowley. Wyatt brought it in from the road and set it on the kitchen table without opening it, and the 3 words on the outside, "Miss M. Dawson," were in a handwriting she recognized immediately. She'd seen it on ledger entries and rent receipts for 9 years. She opened it. It was short. Crowley's letters always were. He preferred to make his threats in person, but he understood that paper created a record, and he was too clever to put the worst of it in writing. What he'd written was this: that he was aware she'd been in contact with her mother, that her mother was a woman of fragile health and uncertain mind, and would not likely be considered a credible witness in any proceeding, and that it would be a pity if something happened to complicate Miss Dawson's current employment before she'd had a chance to settle in. She read it twice, set it down. Boone looked up from his coffee. "Bad?" "A warning dressed as a letter," she said. Wyatt read it standing by the window. He folded it back, put it in his coat pocket. His expression hadn't changed, which she'd learned to read as something more serious than anger. "He knows," she said. "He knows I wrote to her." "He watches her mail." "Of course he does." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "That means she never got it. Or she got it, and he took it before she could answer." "Or she answered, and he took that too," Wyatt said. A beat of silence with weight in it. "She doesn't know I'm trying to reach her," Maggie said. "She thinks I left and didn't write, same as the last 4 years." Wyatt looked at her. "I can get to her directly. Boone knows people in Red Hollow, folks who aren't in Crowley's pocket. A message can move through different hands." "How long?" "Week, maybe less." She thought about her mother in that town, in Crowley's orbit, carrying what she knew like a stone in her chest for 12 years. All the times Maggie had thought Ruth didn't care, didn't reach out, had left her daughter to sink or swim alone. She saw it differently now, and it cracked something open in her she hadn't known was sealed. "Do it," she said. The week that followed was the hardest of her time at Iron Ridge, and the hardest part wasn't the waiting. It was Wyatt Mercer. Not because he did anything wrong, precisely because he didn't. He was consistent in a way she didn't know how to categorize. Consistent the way good weather is consistent, the way a well-built fence holds. He asked after her in the mornings the way a person asks when they actually want to know the answer. He noticed when she hadn't slept, and didn't comment on it, but quietly put the coffee on earlier. When she burned the biscuits one morning, distracted by a letter she'd been drafting in her head, he ate them without remark, and only said, "I've eaten worse." "When?" she said. "My own cooking, most of last 4 years," he said, which was the closest thing to a joke she'd heard from him, and it startled her into something she recognized, too late, as genuine laughter. The sound of it surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. She stopped laughing. They looked at each other across the breakfast table. "You should do that more," he said, and went back to his biscuit. She got up and went to the stove to have something to do with her face. That was the problem. He was careful. Careful with her the way you're careful with something you respect. He never pressed. He never positioned himself between her and a door. He never made her feel like the room was smaller when he was in it, which was, she was realizing, a thing she hadn't known was possible. She'd spent her whole life contracting around men, making herself smaller, quieter, less visible. It was survival. She knew that now, in a way she couldn't have named before. And here on Iron Ridge Ranch, she kept waiting for the moment she'd need to contract again. And the moment kept not coming. And that was somehow harder than if it had. Trust was more terrifying than suspicion. Suspicion she knew how to hold. She was sitting on the porch on a Thursday evening, working through this in the way she worked through most difficult things. Quietly, by herself, with her hands busy on a mending project, when Wyatt sat down in the other chair and said, without preamble, "You're waiting for something to go wrong." She kept her eyes on the mending. "Excuse me?" "With me. With here." He wasn't looking at her either, both of them addressing the dark, which made it easier. "You've been holding yourself a step back since the day you arrived. Not the work. The work, you give everything. The rest of it, you're keeping a door open to leave through." She set down the mending. "Most people would call that sense." "Most people haven't done anything to earn your sense pointing at them," he said. She turned and looked at him. "Is that a complaint, Mr. Mercer?" "No." He met her eyes. "It's just the truth as I see it. I'm not asking you to trust what you don't have reason to trust yet. I just want you to know that I see it, and it doesn't bother me. I'll wait." Something sharp and unfamiliar moved through her. "You keep saying that you'll wait, like my comfort level is a crop you're planning to harvest." "No," he said again, and his voice was very even. "Like it's your own, and you'll tend it how you see fit, and I've got no business reaching for it before you offer it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Who are you?" she said, and she didn't mean it as a question about his name or his ranch or his land claim. She meant it the way you ask it when someone has just done something that doesn't fit the shape of anyone you've ever known. He looked back at her steadily. "Just a man," he said, "trying to do right by the people in his life." She picked up the mending. Her hands were not entirely steady. They sat in silence for a while, and the silence was the kind she'd stopped bracing against, and that, in itself, was the answer to the question she hadn't quite asked. On the 11th day, Boone rode back from Red Hollow before noon, hours early, and he came in fast, which was the first sign that something had changed. He didn't unsaddle the horse. He came straight to the house, and Maggie was in the kitchen, and she heard him on the porch and came to the door. And one look at Boone's face told her the news was not small. "Your mother," he said. Her hand found the door frame. "She's all right," he said quickly. "She's all right. She's here." "Here?" "Followed me out. Said she wasn't waiting for another letter to go missing." He stepped aside, and behind him, at the edge of the yard, was a woman Maggie hadn't seen in 4 years. Ruth Dawson was smaller than Maggie remembered. Or maybe she'd always been this small, and Maggie had been seeing her through a child's eyes for too long. She was thin, tired, wearing a dress that had been washed too many times, and she was standing in the yard of Iron Ridge Ranch, like she expected to be told to leave. Maggie walked off the porch. She walked across the yard and stopped 2 feet from her mother, and they looked at each other in the July heat. And everything Maggie had planned to say when this moment finally came, the careful, contained speech she'd been composing for 9 years, dissolved completely. "You came," she said. Her voice was not steady. Ruth's eyes filled. "Your letter," she started. "Crowley took it." He showed it to me. Ruth's jaw tightened. To show me he'd taken it. Said you'd moved on and forgotten about me. Said... She stopped. I believed him. 2 days. Then Boone's man found me at the market, and I... She looked down. I packed what I had, and I walked to the crossroads before Crowley knew I was gone. Maggie looked at her mother, at the lines in her face, the careful way she held herself, the posture of a woman who'd been small for so long she'd forgotten what standing straight felt like. She knew that posture. She'd worn it herself. She closed the 2 feet between them, and she put her arms around her mother, and Ruth Dawson made a sound that had no language in it. Just years of compressed things finally finding a direction, and held on. They stood like that in the yard of Iron Ridge, while the July morning burned around them, and Maggie didn't let go until her mother stopped shaking. Ruth sat at the kitchen table with both hands around a cup of coffee and told them what she'd seen in Crowley's back office 12 years ago. And she told it with the flat precision of a woman who'd been turning the memory over for so long she knew every edge of it. Thomas Hale had been sitting across from Crowley. The papers were already drawn. A man named Garrett, Crowley's man, always, had been standing by the window. Ruth had come in through the connecting door from the mercantile floor, the door that was supposed to be locked, but whose lock Crowley had let go unrepaired because it was useful to him to come and go without people noticing. Hale had been crying. Not quietly, openly, the way a man cries when he's been broken past the point of caring about dignity. He'd said, "I don't want to sign this. This is my land. My children were born on this land." And Crowley had said, "Sign the paper, Thomas, or I'll call the notes on your supplies, and you won't have the land or the money to feed those children through winter." And Hale had signed. Ruth had stood in that doorway and watched the whole thing, and hadn't made a sound. "Why?" Maggie asked, and she kept her voice as gentle as she could, because she knew part of the answer, and needed to hear the rest. Ruth's hands tightened on the cup. "Because Crowley saw me. After Hale left. He saw me, and he smiled." She looked up, and he said, "You're going to forget what you just witnessed, Ruth, or I'm going to remember what I know about Margaret's father." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Maggie felt the world tilt for the second time since Iron Ridge. "My father." Ruth looked at her daughter. "Your father didn't leave," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Crowley ran him out. He'd tried to report Crowley to the county sheriff about a different land matter. Years before Hale, Crowley had enough people in enough places to make sure the report went nowhere, and the man who made it had reasons to leave quickly." She set down the cup. "I was 3 months pregnant when he left. I didn't know all of it until later. By the time I understood, Crowley already had what he needed to keep me quiet." Maggie sat very still. 9 years of her life arranged itself into a different shape. The indifferent mother, the missing father, the debt that never cleared. All of it, reaching back to a man in a back office and a door with a broken lock. "He built a cage around both of us," she said. "Yes," Ruth said. Wyatt had been standing at the far end of the kitchen, and she'd almost forgotten he was there until he spoke. "Mrs. Dawson," his voice was careful, "would you be willing to put in writing what you just told us? Signed and witnessed?" Ruth looked at him. She studied him the way she'd probably studied every man who'd offered anything in the last decade, with the wariness of someone who'd been wrong too many times. "He'll come after me," she said. "He'll try," Wyatt said. "But a signed statement in my lawyer's hands in Cheyenne, combined with what Hale's neighbors recorded about the condition of that deed, Crowley won't be able to touch it without exposing himself. And when it's exposed, the thing he's been using to keep you both quiet stops working. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. She looked at Maggie. "You trust him?" she asked. Maggie thought about $12 on the edge of a washtub. She thought about a mare named July, and a porch in the dark, and a man who said, "I'll wait," like it cost him nothing. "I'm learning to," she said. Ruth looked back at Wyatt. "Get me the paper," she said. "I've been carrying this 12 years. It's past time I put it down." Wyatt left the kitchen without a word. He came back with paper and ink, and Boone came in from the porch, and Ruth Dawson wrote in her careful hand the truest and most dangerous thing she'd ever put to paper. When she was done, she set down the pen, and her hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat on the table the way Maggie had always done. That same gesture in those same hands, and Maggie felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't known was locked. They were the same, her and her mother, shaped by the same hands into the same habits of bracing. The difference was that Ruth had braced alone for 12 years. Maggie was not going to let that stand another day. "You're staying here," she said. "There's room?" Ruth looked up. "I'm not asking," Maggie said, "and I'm not giving you the chance to talk yourself back into that town." She held her mother's eyes. "You're staying. That's final." Wyatt looked at her across the table with something in his face that she didn't have a category for yet. Something that went past the not-quite smile, past the warmth she'd been careful not to lean into too hard. And she looked away before she could name it. Ruth pressed her lips together and nodded once, and that was that. Outside, the afternoon was burning hot and clear, and somewhere on a road from Red Hollow, a man named Crowley was going to realize very soon that 2 of the 3 people who could unravel his entire operation had just walked out of his reach. And Maggie Dawson, for the first time in the 32 years of her life, was not afraid of what happened next. She was ready for it. Wyatt rode to Cheyenne the next morning before dawn. He didn't make a production of it. He told Maggie the night before, straight, no ceremony, that he was taking Ruth's signed statement to Edward Holt personally, that he'd be 3 days gone, that Boone knew what to do if anything moved in Red Hollow. "And if Crowley comes here while you're gone?" she said. "He won't." He pulled on his coat. "He doesn't know yet how much has changed. He thinks he sent a warning letter and rattled you. He'll wait to see if it worked." "And when he figures out it didn't?" "By then, the statement's in Holt's hands and filed with the county court." He looked at her. 3 days, Miss Dawson." She nodded. She didn't tell him to be careful, because he wasn't the kind of man who needed to be told, and she wasn't the kind of woman who said things just to fill silence. He rode out. She watched him go from the kitchen window, and then turn back to the stove, because there was breakfast to make, and her mother was asleep in the room next to hers, and the Callow brothers needed feeding, and that was what she had for right now. Concrete things, real work. She focused on those. She was good at focusing on those. The first day passed quiet. Ruth slept most of it, which told Maggie more about how badly her mother had been running on empty than anything Ruth had actually said. She came out for supper looking cleaner and smaller at the same time, like washing off Red Hollow's dust had also removed some of the armor she'd been wearing under it. They didn't talk about Crowley. They didn't talk about Maggie's father, or the 12 years, or any of the things that were sitting in the room with them large as furniture. They talked about small things. Ruth asked about the ranch. Maggie told her about July, the mare, the naming of her, and Ruth smiled, and it was her mother's real smile, the one Maggie could remember from being very small, before everything. "You always did name everything," Ruth said. "You named the cat at the laundry. Mr. Buttons. It was missing 2 legs. That didn't make it less of a cat." Ruth laughed. It sounded rusty, like something that hadn't been used properly in years. Maggie heard it and felt the crack in her chest from part 4 open a little wider. Not painfully, more like a window, letting something in. After supper, Boone stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Ruth with his usual economy of expression. "You need anything, ma'am? You let me know." Ruth blinked. She clearly wasn't used to that kind of offer arriving without strings. "Thank you," she said carefully. Boone nodded and left. Ruth looked at Maggie. "He's trustworthy?" she asked quietly. "Completely," Maggie said. Ruth turned her cup in her hands. "You've built something here." "It's not mine," Maggie said. "I didn't say it was yours," Ruth said. "I said you'd built something. That's different." She looked at her daughter with the particular directness of a woman who'd spent years not saying what she meant, and was apparently deciding to stop. "He cares about you." "He's my employer." "Maggie?" "Mama." Ruth set down her cup. "I spent 12 years pretending I couldn't see things clearly because seeing them clearly hurt too much. I'm not doing that anymore." She held Maggie's eyes. "That man rode 30 miles, paid your debt, bought you a horse, and went to Cheyenne on a 3-day ride to protect the both of us. Do with that what you will." Maggie opened her mouth, closed it. "I'm going to bed," Ruth said, and stood up and went. Maggie sat alone in the kitchen for a long time after. Wyatt came back on the 3rd day, mid-afternoon, earlier than she'd expected. She heard the gray horse in the yard and came out, and before she could ask, he said, "It's filed. Holt's moving fast. He thinks the case is solid." Something loosened in her shoulders she hadn't known was tight. And Holt found Thomas Hale. He dismounted, started unsaddling. "Man's been living in Colorado. He's willing to testify. Said he's been waiting 12 years for someone to give him a reason." The news moved through her like a current. "Crowley's finished." "Not yet, but close." He handed off the gray to Felix without looking away from her. "Close enough that he's going to know it soon, which means he's going to do something." "What kind of something?" "The desperate kind," he said. "Men like Crowley don't go quietly. They go loudly, and they try to make other people loud too, and they use whatever they have left." He looked at her. "He's got one card left to play." She understood immediately. "Me." "Your testimony about your working conditions, the rent manipulation, the pattern of it. Holt says it establishes Crowley's method, shows this wasn't one isolated incident with Hale. It was how he operated." He paused. "I told Holt I'd ask you. He's not requiring it. He has enough without it. But with it, there's no way Crowley walks out of this with anything." She stood in the yard of Iron Ridge Ranch and thought about standing up in a county court and saying in front of witnesses what 9 years at Crowley's Mercantile had looked like. She thought about the coins and the dirt and the shed she'd slept in, and the debt that never fully cleared, and every morning of Gerald Crowley standing too close and calling it protection. She thought about Dottie, still there, 16 years old and still stupid enough to be angry about things. "Yes," she said. "Maggie." "I said yes." She met his eyes. "When?" Crowley moved first. 4 days later, a Tuesday morning, hot enough to make the air shimmer, Boone came in from the east pasture at a run, which Boone did not do, which meant the world had shifted on its axis. "Riders coming," he said. 3 of them. Crowley and 2 men I don't know." Wyatt was on his feet before Boone finished the sentence. "How far?" 20 minutes, maybe less." He looked at Maggie. "He's not alone. One of the men rides like Garrett." Garrett. Ruth had said that name. Crowley's man, always. The one who'd been in the back office when Thomas Hale signed the paper. Ruth heard her name in the silence and came to the kitchen door. One look at their faces and she went pale. "He's coming," she said. "Yes," Wyatt said. Ruth's hands went to the table. Her jaw tightened. Maggie had seen that tightening 1,000 times in her childhood, and always read it as hardness, as not caring. She understood it now for what it was, a woman bracing. "Mama," Maggie went to her, "you don't have to be here for this." "He's coming to my daughter's house," Ruth said. Her voice was not steady, but it was firm. "I've been running from that man for 12 years. I'm not going to another room." Maggie looked at her mother, the tired, thin, iron-spined truth of her, and felt something swell in her chest that had no clean name. "All right," she said. Wyatt looked at Boone. "Get Felix and Tomas in from the pasture." "Already sent word." Boone pulled his hat on. "They'll be at the fence line." "Nobody starts anything," Wyatt said. "We hear what he has to say. That's all." Crowley rode into the yard of Iron Ridge Ranch, like he was riding into a town he owned, which was the only way he knew how to ride anywhere. He had Garrett on his left and Deputy Reeves on his right, and Reeves had his badge on and his hand resting near his holster, and the combination of it was clearly designed to arrive looking like authority. Maggie stood on the porch, Wyatt beside her, Boone at the yard fence, Felix and Tomas visible at the corner of the barn. Ruth was in the doorway behind them, and Maggie could feel her mother's presence there, like a heat at her back. Crowley looked at the arrangement, and something flickered in his face. Calculation. Reassessment. And then the company smile went on. "Mercer," he said. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," Wyatt said. "What do you want, Crowley?" The smile stayed. He looked at Maggie. "Just came to have a conversation with Miss Dawson. Person to person." He spread his hands. "No hard feelings about how things ended in Red Hollow. I was hoping we could talk it through." "We've got nothing to talk through," Maggie said. "I think you might feel different after you hear what I have to say." He dismounted, slowly, deliberately, making it a performance. "See, I've been hearing some things. Rumors about a statement filed in Cheyenne. About Thomas Hale." He said the name like it was a test. "Now I know that can't be right, because any statement made about private business transactions between me and a former customer would be, well, it'd be the word of a woman of uncertain character against a pillar of the Red Hollow community." He paused. "No offense to your mother, Maggie. You know how these things go." "Get off my property," Wyatt said. "Now hold on." Reeves moved his horse forward a step, thumb still near the holster. "I'm here in an official capacity. Crowley's got a legal concern to address." "Then address it through my lawyer," Wyatt said. "Edward Holt, Cheyenne. You know his name already." Crowley's smile slipped 1 degree. "See, here's the thing about lawyers. They work with what they have. And what they have right now is a statement from a woman with a documented history of unreliability, memory troubles. That's how it'll read in court." He looked at Ruth in the doorway. "No offense, Ruth. You know I've always looked out for you." Ruth came off the doorstep. Maggie moved to put herself beside her mother. But Ruth was already at the porch rail, and her voice, when it came out, was not the voice of a woman who'd been running for 12 years. "You have not looked out for me one day in your life, Gerald Crowley," Ruth said. "You kept me close because I knew what you did to Thomas Hale. And you kept my daughter tied to your building because keeping her was how you kept me. That's not looking out for someone. That's owning them." She gripped the rail. "And I am done being owned." Crowley's face went through several expressions in quick succession. The smile dropped entirely. Garrett shifted on his horse. Reeves looked between Crowley and the women on the porch, with the expression of a man realizing he may have ridden into something he wasn't paid enough for. "Ruth," Crowley said, very quietly, "you need to think very carefully." "She's had 12 years to think," Maggie said. "She's done thinking. We both are." Deputy Reeves. Wyatt stepped to the edge of the porch. His voice was level and final, and it carried across the yard with the clarity of a man who's decided exactly where the line is. "You're standing on my property. You have no jurisdiction here and no warrant. I'm asking you to take your employer and ride back to Red Hollow." He looked directly at Reeves. "I'm also going to remind you that as a sworn officer, you are present at a confrontation with witnesses who are cooperating with a county court proceeding. Anything that happens here goes into that record." Reeves went very still. "Ed Holt told me to say exactly that," Wyatt added, "if you showed up." The silence that followed had the quality of a held breath. Garrett looked at Crowley. Something passed between them, the look of men recalculating, and Maggie watched Crowley's face and saw it. The moment a man recognizes that the game has moved past him and his options have narrowed to one. "This isn't over," Crowley said. "Yes, it is," Maggie said. "You just haven't caught up yet." Crowley looked at her for a long moment, a look that was meant to land like a threat and didn't, because she was standing on a porch at Iron Ridge Ranch with her mother beside her, and Wyatt Mercer 2 feet to her left, and Boone at the fence. And she was not in an alley anymore. She was not bending to pick up coins. She was not saying, "Yes, ma'am," to people who weren't worth her breath. She held his gaze and did not look away, and did not contract. He broke first. He turned his horse without another word. Garrett followed. Reeves lingered half a second, looked at Wyatt, and then turned and rode after them. The yard was quiet. Nobody moved until the hoofbeats faded entirely. Ruth let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere below her lungs. Her hands were shaking on the rail. Maggie covered them with her own. "You did good," Maggie said. "I shook the whole time," Ruth said. "I know. You did it anyway." Edward Holt moved fast. Within 3 weeks, the county court had Crowley's original deed flagged for review. Within a month, Thomas Hale's testimony, taken in Colorado and delivered by letter to the court, had been entered as evidence. Ruth's statement, and the pattern of rent manipulation Maggie described in her own deposition, combined into something Holt called the strongest case of documented coercion he'd seen in 12 years of practice. Crowley's lawyer made noise. That was all it was, noise. The kind that sounds like something and means nothing when the facts are lined up clean and correct. On a Wednesday in August, the land claim on Thomas Hale's north parcel was voided. Crowley's mercantile deed came under secondary review for 3 other transactions that Holt's examination had turned up. Deputy Reeves resigned his post before the week was out, quietly, with no announcement, which was the move of a man who understood when to get off a sinking thing. Red Hollow moved on the way small towns do, slowly, with a lot of pointed silence and a rapid redistribution of opinions. People who had never had anything bad to say about Maggie Dawson found they had always felt that way. She didn't go back to watch it. There was no reason to go back. She was in the kitchen on a Thursday morning, the kind of August morning that had decided to be beautiful. All clear light and cooler air, and the smell of it finally not punishing. When Wyatt came in and stood at the kitchen door and said, "I need to talk to you." Something in his voice made her put down the coffee pot. "All right," she said. He came to the table and sat across from her. He put both hands flat on the surface the way he did when he was working through something. Methodical, deliberate. And he looked at her with the expression she'd been learning to read since July. The one that wasn't the not quite smile. the one that was something further along than that. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know before I ask that the job stands regardless. The room stands. Your mother stays as long as she wants. None of that changes depending on your answer." He paused. "I need you to believe that before I say the rest." She looked at him. Her heart was doing something loud and inconvenient. "I believe it," she said. He held her eyes. "I would like to court you properly, if you're willing." He said it the way he said everything, plain, straight, no decoration. "I know what I am. I know this ranch isn't much yet. I know you've had reasons to keep a door open to leave through, and I'm not asking you to close it." He stopped. "I'm asking you to consider that you might not need it." The kitchen was very still. She thought about her first morning in this kitchen, burning biscuits because she was composing letters in her head. She thought about a mare named July and a porch in the dark, and the way he'd said, "You're an employee." Big difference, like the distinction mattered to him more than the outcome. She thought about $12 on the edge of a washtub and the truth he'd told her the moment she'd asked hard enough for it. She thought about her mother saying, "I didn't say it was yours. I said you'd built something." "Wyatt." She said his name, his first name, for the first time, and felt it settle into the air between them like something that had been waiting a long time to be said. "I've been keeping that door open since I was 14 years old. It's the only thing that kept me standing." "I know," he said. He didn't flinch from it. "I don't know how to not keep it open," she said. "I don't know if I remember how to do this. Any of it." She pressed her hands flat on the table. That old gesture, the one her mother had, the one they both learned in that town. "I'm not easy. I don't trust fast. I'll fight you on things that maybe don't need fighting, because that's what I know." "All right," he said. "I'll probably burn the biscuits again." Something happened to his face then. The full version of the thing she'd been watching live half-finished all summer. And it was so different from not quite smiling that she almost had to look away. "I've survived worse biscuits," he said. "When?" "Every morning for 4 years." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You can court me." The smile stayed. It was worth the wait. "One condition," she said. "Name it." "You never use the word employer at me again." She held his eyes. "We've been past that for a while, and I think we both know it." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, steady and warm and asking nothing, and said, "Agreed." Ruth Dawson stayed at Iron Ridge Ranch. She took over the kitchen garden with the focused energy of a woman making up for lost time. And by September, she had things growing in that plot that Boone claimed weren't possible this far north, which Ruth treated as a personal challenge. Dottie Crane arrived at Iron Ridge on a Tuesday in late August, with a bundle under one arm and the address written on a piece of paper Maggie had sent through Holt's office. "I figured," she said on the porch, "that if you could leave, I could leave." She was 16 and still stupid enough to be angry about things. Maggie looked at her for a long moment and thought, "Good." "Come in," she said. "I'll get you something to eat." September came in golden and cool, and on a Saturday morning that smelled like the summer finally finishing what it had started, Wyatt Mercer and Maggie Dawson stood in the small church at the crossroads. Not the one in Red Hollow, never that one, with Boone and Felix and Tomas and Ruth and Dottie as witnesses. And they made promises to each other, in plain language, that meant exactly what it said. The preacher asked if she would have this man, and she said yes without hesitation, because she'd made the real decision 3 months ago in an alley in July, when a stranger on a gray horse took his hat off and called her ma'am, and she felt the bolt in her chest begin to move. When it was done, they walked out into the September morning, and Wyatt put her hand on his arm, and she let it stay there. Let herself lean into the solid fact of him, the way you finally lean into a fence you've tested long enough to trust. And she did not reach for the door she used to keep open, because she had built something better than a door. She had built a place. A real one. The kind that has her name on it. Maggie Dawson had walked into Red Hollow with nothing but 2 hands willing to work, and walked out of it with everything that mattered. And the woman who'd once bent to pick coins from the dirt stood in the September light of Iron Ridge Ranch and understood, down to the bone, that she had never been worth less than this moment. She had always been exactly this worth. It had just taken the right road to bring her home.